Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome very much to the Khalili Lecture Theatre, not our usual venue for our BC talks, but delighted to be here, partly because the British Academy is being refurbished, which means we don't have a space to hold the lecture, but actually, of course, this is a wonderful venue. And so we're very grateful to SOAS for allowing us to be here. My thanks to our Vice Chair, Rosalind Wade-Haddon, for organising that. And it's my great pleasure to welcome this evening's speaker. He probably actually needs very little introduction to everyone here because he's a great friend, of course, to BC long term, but crucially, he is our honorary treasurer. And I can't tell you how delighted I was when looking for our treasurer that Tim agreed to join our council. And he's brought so much experience and expertise to bear. And that experience, of course, is wide-ranging, not least in terms of archaeology. And as we'll hear this afternoon, his focus is very much on the world of the Kassites, and it was this that he did his PhD at Oxford under the supervision of Roger Morey. He is a fellow of Wolfson College at Oxford, but before he took up, as it were, a base in Oxford, he has had a very distinguished career in the Foreign Office. So having excavated in Iraq during the 1980s, took advantage of foreign climes and joined the Foreign Office. But since that time, he's moved back to Oxford to become Bursar of Green Templeton College. And it is through that expertise, of course, through his control of the administration and management of the college that he brings that expertise to BC, for which we're extremely grateful. This evening, however, he returns to that field where he started his expertise and really has become one of the leading experts in our understanding of the Kassites. And so today I'm delighted that he will talk to us about MBA, Middle Bronze Age Kassites, and LBA, Late Bronze Age Kassite site. Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, and very generous introduction. First of all, welcome everybody, and welcome everybody who's watching this online. I don't know who you are, but I know some of the people who are joining up, so very pleased to have you all here this evening. As Paul says, I am a bit of a Kassite nut, and my wife calls herself a Kassite widow sometimes, but it is a long-standing fascination. This lecture was supposed to happen a year ago in June, and various things, illness, train strikes, I can't remember what else, meant it didn't happen. And in a way, I'm quite pleased because the work I've done since means it's a slightly different lecture to the one I would have given in June last year. And it is a lecture in two parts. First of all, on basically where did the Kassites come from? It's a vexed question. It's been going on for years. And I've come up with an idea which I wanted to float tonight to see what people think. And then secondly, that's Middle Bronze Age, which for people who might not be completely familiar with it, the period we're talking about is circa 1850 to 1500 BC. So 3,500 years ago, 3,800, 3,500 years ago. And then a late Bronze Age Kassite site, and here I must acknowledge the Iraqi colleagues with whom I've been working on this, and there's a little team, we'll talk about it. And I'm pleased some Iraqi colleagues are joining us online tonight. But the late Bronze Age site is just hard edge Kassite, total Kassite. It's lovely. One of the few I've been involved in and really rather pleasing. So without further ado, it is a lecture in two parts. I'm told the drinks are starting at 7:15, so I either speed up or slow down depending on cues from Ali at the back. But let's start off. As I say, the lecture in two parts, and I'll be tackling them separately. But let's start with where did they come from? Very early on in Assyriological studies, some of the key texts involving early Kassite history and a couple of dictionaries, Akkadian Kassite language dictionaries, became available. And in a sense, they colored the study or the area pretty much until the last 20, 30 years. Because what they did was they kind of showed the Kassites to be a violent invader coming in from probably the east, but it wasn't clear. And the key records were, and I hope these can be seen from there, 2 or 3 year names, which showed in the 18th century, the Kassites fighting the old Babylonian kings. They're pretty straightforward account, ripping out the foundation of the force of the Kassites at Kikala, probably in northern Babylonia. That sounds like a war. The evil Kassites from the barbarous country who couldn't be driven back to the mountains. Not much ambiguity in that. And then, the great gods An and Enlil with Marduk helped me defeat the Kassite forces. Pretty straightforward. And in parallel, as more and more material became published in the 20th century, early 20th century and onwards, people bearing Kassite names started being found in Old Babylonian texts, but in pretty routine, in ration lists, in administration lists, pretty boring, straightforward people part of the Old Babylonian society. So there's always been a bit of a mystery. Where did they come from? And there was a sort of a sense also, a lot of the early scholars were classicists, and related people, the Kassoi, appear in the accounts of the campaigns of Alexander the Great in the Zagros. And so it was sort of 2 and 2 was put together, and a whole sort of theory came that the Kassites must have come out of the east and invaded Babylonia, and in the end took over after the end of the old Babylonian dynasty at the beginning of the 16th century. Bit of a map showing the area. We've got Babylonia down here in the south. We've got the Gutians, the infamous mountain of people in the east. We've got Assyria in the north, Yamchat, the great kingdom in western Syria, and Katna, northern Levant, the Levantine area. This is blank because it's largely desert. So not to say there weren't people there, but it's nobody really ran that area. So the Kassites came from somewhere over there. The linguistic evidence, such as it is quite limited. There's a couple of dictionaries. Quite a lot of the words are to do with horses and the colors of horses and things like that. So that added another thing. These were the people who brought horses into warfare into Babylonia, and that's partially how they helped crack the kingdom. There was another strand of discussion, particularly before the Second World War, about whether or not they were Indo-European. That discussion has continued since. It hasn't really been settled, and there's no conclusive evidence, partially because we don't have enough of their language to tell us. There's a slight hint that in the first quarter of the 18th century, at a site Shemshara, which is, do I remember how this works? Over here. There's some documents there which has a place name, a toponym, Kunshum, which might be related to a similar toponym in a Nuzi document of the late 15th century. That could be Kassite, not sure, but it's not. One of the interesting things, first quarter of the 18th century, is one of immense conflict. All these kingdoms, basically Amorite, were all in a shifting pattern of alliances, wars, all of them struggling for power. This is a period with Hammurabi and how he melded his great kingdom. We've got to the east, we've got the kingdom of Elam, they took part in it, Eshnuna. Everybody was jostling around for power. And at Mari, there on the middle Euphrates, just there was a huge, huge archive of documents has been found. And over the past 50 years have been translated and published. And it gives minute detail, a lot of detail on, admittedly, a Mari-centric view of what those wars were. A lot of names, a lot of people, a lot of activity, a lot of alliances, but not a single Kassite. No mention at all. So at least at the beginning of the 18th century, in that area, nothing. Very strange. If we look at the archaeological evidence, I'm afraid that doesn't help us much either. These are all the sites east of the Tigris that have Kassite remains on them. And you can see the earliest one, Tel Muhammad, which is just down in the suburbs of modern Baghdad, has got a great archive of documents, still not properly published, but most people in the field have seen the thesis in which they have been studied, full of Kassite personal names, probably 2 or 3, well, at least 2 of the early Kassite kings. And there's mention of being settled X number of years after Babylon. What is this resettlement of? Was it after the fall of Babylon in 1595? Again, but it seems there was a Kassite community, probably linked to the early Kassite dynasty in the area of Baghdad. But that is the earliest. So that is pretty late, mid-16th century. So what's been going on there? The sites after that don't really help us much on saying where the Kassites came from. They're all nice sites, but they don't really tell us much about origins. So I thought I'd start looking at it from another angle. You know, what else, was there another way of seeing where the Kassites may have come from, or at least where did Kassite Babylonia come from? And of all the improbable places, I ended up with the Old Testament in Genesis. And I was intrigued by the use of the word Shinar. It occurs 8 times. And that's the bit from Genesis, the famous bit that talks about the Tower of Babylon. And it occurred to me, why Shinar? It's not a Babylonian word. Why did these people, they were exiles, obviously, from the Levant, why did they use Shinar when they obviously knew they were in a land that wasn't called Shinar? Hadn't really been tested that. I put the New Testament book of Revelations, obviously, is much, much later. The Genesis and much of the Old Testament composed in the 6th, 5th century BC by the exiled scholars in Babylon. The book of Revelations written much later. And there the word Babylon is used, straightforward Babylon. In the Old Testament, it's Shinar. So it sort of intrigued me. Where did this term come from? And this led me to hieroglyphics of all places. And those of you who saw the British Museum exhibition, the recent one on the decipherment of hieroglyphics, will have seen how the process worked. But by the 1850s, hieroglyphics could be translated and were being read. And a very early scholar, very distinguished German, Heinrich Brüsch, did a lot of work on the annals of Thutmosis III, so early 15th century. And his accounts of his great battles and campaigns in Syria, northern Syria, and in particular, his 8th campaign, 1446, where he got all the way up to here. This is a great bend of the Euphrates. And Brüsch made the identification of Shinar with the word SNGR, Sinjar, that appears in the annals of Thutmosis III, and identified SNGR, Sinjar, with Shinar, Babylonia, and did this little map published in 1850. This is the hieroglyphics for Shinar. The rest of it's Nahrain and other places. His work was somewhat ignored for a bit, but it's actually been adopted pretty solidly since, and it's accepted that it is a cognate of Shinar. And these are the standard works that list all the appearances of the word in Egyptian topographical texts. And there's a lot of them. But this is still being used. This still doesn't quite get us to Kassites. About in 1966, another scholar, Michael Astor, argued that a further cognate, another form of the word Shinar, appeared in the Hittite texts as Sankhara, and in one Amarna letter, Shankar. And I'll come back to that because it's so we've got a few more cognates of the term appearing. Then in 1984, Ran Zadok, an Israeli scholar, made a further identification, and this was the crucial one. And it's taken us all a while to catch up with the implications of what he did. And this one was Samharu. It's a term that appears in some letters of the time of Amid-Saduqa, one of the late old Babylonian kings. And he linked Samharu all the way back to Shinar, Sinjar. Now, so we've got these various forms of the word. It's all the same word, all means the same place. But it means the same place to different people at different times. And that's the trick. Just blanket translation of Babylonia, I think, doesn't work. And I'll take you through that. I started mapping out, well, where did these things appear? In Samharu, the very first mentions of it appear in the accounts of the Hittite king Hattusili in the 1650s, 1620s, in his wars on the Middle Euphrates. This was part of the great push by the Hittite kingdom to move into Syria. And it's wars that went on for 20, 30, 40 years. And he talks about meeting the Samharu on the Middle Euphrates as part of these wars. At pretty much the same time, in the reign of Amid-Saduqa, right down in Babylonia, so quite a long way down the Euphrates, around the town of Sippar in northern Babylonia, there's a small group of letters, 4 or 5, that talk about the Samharu and the Bimatu. We'll come back to the Bimatu in a minute, as part of a sort of quasi-mercenary force fighting for the king around that area. But in these texts, they're pretty straightforward administrative documents. It's issuing rations of beer, bread. It's nothing special. But we've got pretty much at the same time, we've got Samharu up on the Middle Euphrates, not fighting the Hittites. It looks as though they're fighting with them as allies. And there's a ditto down in Babylonia. A little bit later, again, the Annals of Mursili I. This is the chap who is credited with sacking Babylon in 1595 and drawing a close to the old Babylonian dynasty. He again refers to events recording in northern Syria, in which the Samharu appear. So there's a very middle Euphrates feel to this, but also the same people down in Babylonia. The bottom line there, Samharu, probably a Kassite group. We just need to understand a little bit about how the Kassites came into Babylonia, and a couple of scholars have done a lot of work, particularly Frans van Koppen, who in a paper in 2017 outlined what he called 3 waves of Kassites. I put it into 4 because I think there's a slightly earlier one, which is individuals whose names we can identify as Kassite appearing before the reign of Samsu-iluna. That was when we had that year name about the battle at Kikala. But he talked about, they're actually identified as Kassites in the text, Kashu. They appear in the reign of Samsu-iluna in force. Bimatu, some of whom identified as Kassites, appear a little bit later in the reign of Abi-Eshur, in the king who ruled after Samsu-iluna. So we're now into the late 18th, early 17th century. And then a little bit later, 40, 50 years later, we get Samharu in association with the Bimatu in these texts of Amid-Saduqa. The Bimatu, we remember, are Kassite, identified in the text as Kassite. In the association, it's a very direct one. The Bimatu all appear to be charioteers, and the Samharu foot soldiers, and they're working in conjunction with each other. And anybody who's ever been involved in big logistic movements will know that trying to get 1,000 cavalry persons plus troops moving around together as a coherent fighting force, that's quite an achievement, and it doesn't just happen. I think that suggests that the relationship between the two groups had been going on much longer before the reign of Amid-Saduqa, 20 or 30 years. The There is a very late oracle text from the Near Assyrian period that lists the Samharu and the Kassites as part of the ranged forces that saw at the end of the Old Babylon. But as Seth Richardson has pointed out, I think he's identified 15 different versions of the story of just who put an end to Babylon. So I'm not sure that's terribly significant, but the Samharu do feature in there. When you map all this onto chronological and geographical chart, I think it starts getting quite interesting, because you see on the left, these are the Babylonian references, and I'm not going to go through them in detail. You could see them. These are the ones from North Syria, Hittite, Anatolia. Then we get to the Egyptians, and very last, the group I think which is probably the most interesting in terms of Shinar, what I call a sort of a Levantine group. But you could see the Babylonian appearances. The Samharu feature very briefly in the reign of Amit-Saduqa, Bimatu, and all the rest. There is nothing after the second half of the 17th century. There's one single reference to a Samharu female in one of the Sealand texts, and that's about it. But in Babylonia, the term just stops. In the Syrian Hittite records, it carries on a little bit. It stops around about the same time, at the end of the beginning of the 16th century. But you get a few references appearing again in the 14th century. The one in particular, there's an as yet unpublished letter from the site of Shapinua, which is a diplomatic letter that talks about a lot of the events going on around the Orontes area, and Shankara features again. Otherwise, the references are a little bit odd. And in Egypt, they start in 1446 with Thutmose III. In the early references, up until Amenophis II, the references are all quite positive. These are rulers, they're bringing gifts. From Thutmose IV, 1400, a contemporary of the great king Kurigalzu in Babylonia, who actually was in alliance with the pharaoh, the tone changes completely. And from then on, all the way through to the Ptolemaic period, as I said, there's about 30 references. The SNGR are always represented as prisoners. And I think it's probably more to do with the iconography of what a pharaoh did. He was the person who established order out of the chaos of the universe, rather than any reality. Thutmose IV did not conquer Babylonia. He did not conquer big chunks of northern Syria. So the question, what's going on here? I think when you look at all the evidence, and I haven't had a chance to go through it all tonight, what we've got is a Kassite presence on the Middle Euphrates. Kassite houses. We've got this rather enigmatic Kastiliashu of Hana. He's the only Kassite name in a sea of Amorites at Hana. So quite what he's doing. We've got the Hittite references up in Western Syria, all of which tend to talk about a Syrian or Middle Euphrates location. No Samharu in Babylonia after the 17th, after the last half of the 16th century. I think there's a gap in the Egyptian records. That period, the 17th century, this is the second intermediate period. This is the Hyksos and all of that. There are not many records. But the archaeology shows that there were very close links between northern Egypt and the Levant. That whole area, it was largely Amorite. And the various kinship groups, of course, they were fighting each other all the time, but there were kinship groups, relationships. And I think somehow there would have been knowledge diffused between those groups about the Samharu. Because when we get to the mid-15th century, we suddenly get the Egyptian inscriptions talking about these people that had not appeared in any Egyptian inscriptions previously. So this is the last slide on this. The question is, how did we get from Sippar, where we had the first Kassite back in the 18th century, to Shinar down in the 6th century in the Old Testament? And I think there's two interesting transition points. The first is this transition from Babylonian Hittite to 15th century Egypt. How did that happen? And then, of course, the Egyptian usage to 6th century Exilic Jewish scholars in Babylonia. And this is the bit I'm trying out tonight. I think I'm suggesting that the relationship in that second intermediate period, when we know the Samharu were up on the Middle Euphrates in Syria, led the Egyptian scribes, the scholars, the diplomats, whatever, the officials in the Egyptian court to learn about the Samharu. The Egyptian form of it was SNGR. The interesting point is some point in the 16th century, before the 15th century, when Tutmosis emerges, the association in Egypt between the Samharu and Babylonia happens. It's interesting, in the middle of the 16th century, that's about the time when the Kassite dynasty probably took over control of most of Babylonia from the Sealand dynasty. There'd been a conflict between the Kassite and the Sealand. And at some point in the 16th century, certainly from an Egyptian point of view, whoever these people on the Middle Euphrates were, the Samharu, the SNGR, took control in Babylonia, and the association between the two regions was made. In international correspondence, they use the Babylonian term, Karduniash, the same as in the Hittite treaties, in the texts. It's as if there was a sort of an official language where everybody knew when you were writing officially between each other that the term is Karduniash, but in the vernacular and in your records that are going to be shown locally, you use the old-fashioned, the old word that everybody in Egypt knew, the SNGR. And the theory I'm putting out, the proposal, is that somehow this term SNGR was retained in the Levant as the name for the local name for Babylonia, but it derived from the much earlier form Samharu. I've put these up just for fun because these are the drawings, the representations in Egyptian texts of the singer. The top one is from the side of the chariot of Tutmosis IV, and he was supposed to be a captive. And you can see here this rather beautiful one on the painting on the throne base of Amenophis III, so early 14th century. Beautiful robes, but he's clearly a prisoner. He's kneeling with his hands tied behind his back. This was the iconography of the pharaoh controlling chaos in the universe. But it's an interesting, we don't have many representations of Kassites. Is this really what a Babylonian looked like? Rather nice outfit. The very last slide in this section is this cylinder seal I talked about earlier on. It was made probably at Ugarit for Kurigalzi II, late 14th century. And you can see it bears a hieroglyphic inscription. It doesn't have a normal cuneiform inscription, which is what one would expect on it. This was made for the king. But interestingly, you can see what his title is. So whoever wrote this, who created it on the at Ugarit on the coast of the Mediterranean, thought that was the name. I don't know whether it's an accident, but the seal was actually found in Metsamor in Armenia. So somehow it drifted a long way. But this is the title. That's his name. Yeah, that's the title. And here we have again SNGR. So that's my proposal. It's also a little bit of a chuckle for me because if right, it means that in a very distant echo, the Kassites make it to the Bible, which kind of amuses me a little bit, along with the Hittites and the Egyptians and the Assyrians. Now move to really straightforward archaeology. And I want to start off by saying thank you and acknowledging the work of Iraqi colleagues, particularly the two gentlemen in yellow, who Taha Abad and Karim Swadi, who were the original excavators of the site in 2013, 2014. Been working with Haida al-Mamori, who I'm sure several of us know. He's the assistant professor at the University of Babylon. And in the publication, Petra Kremer, Elena Devetch, and Agneta Larsen have been working on this together. But without the work of the original excavators, none of this would have happened. The site is just outside modern Baghdad and consisted of a cluster of mounds, 7 in all. And you could see a little bit more clearly where it fits in. It was excavated. It was basically a rescue excavation ahead of the development of an outer suburb of Baghdad, Bismaya, which has now been built, has about 600,000 people in it. You could see this was, thanks to Google history, you could see this is the site at the time of excavation on the left-hand side here. You could see Mound 7 here, which we'll be talking about in a minute, and Mound 6. Those were the only 2 mounds that of the 7 that were excavated. And you could see it's now pretty much covered up. The only previous investigation of the mound was by Bob Adams in his great survey of the Diyala region in 1957-58, which he published in 1965. When he walked over the area, he thought, he identified a Sasanian surrounding wall, possibly a fortification, a few old Babylonian sherds, and some limited evidence for Kassite activities. In the years since, various activities have gone on over the site, military, there's been some flooding and agricultural, and the upper levels of the site have been quite badly damaged. And certainly there is no evidence of Sasanian walls anymore. And you could see there's modern Bismaya. So it's well and truly underneath all of that. But 600 people have got nice new houses. So, and what was found? What did the excavators find? Well, remarkably, they found probably the best exposure of Kassite domestic architecture, the best single exposure of Kassite domestic architecture that we have. And I'll be looking at all of this in detail. A small group of tablets, conveniently, always it helps dated to Kadashman Turgu, early 13th century. A lot of graves, a little hoard of metal tools, and we'll look at all of this in a minute. Some cylinder seals, some really interesting faience objects, buckets, a mask, some chariot fittings, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And in the graves, some really remarkable jewelry, a lot of jewelry. An agate eye stone bearing a god's name, Enlil. It's quite rare to have eye stones excavated in controlled excavations. Unfortunately, the bulk of them have been appear on the antiquities market. And of course, pottery, all of them, all of that whole assemblage is a pretty solid dating in the 13th century. I'm going to look at the domestic, Mount 6 was also excavated, but not very much. And as you could see, not an awful lot was found. But there was evidence of late Sassanid remains, early Islamic. There was an Abbasid coin, some glazed pottery, and underneath bits of Kassite buildings and some pottery, but not a lot. You can see, obviously, there would have been a much larger extent of buildings there in the Kassite period, but unfortunately, time did not allow for further excavation. So that's pretty much what we've got. And this is the late Sassanid, early Islamic pottery from Mound 6. On Mound 7, as we'll see in a minute, there are some incantation bowls were found, which is really good dating. But these are, particularly that shallow bowl up on the top right, pretty classic indicators, rather nice stuff. On Mound 7, this is a better view of the domestic architecture, and you could see how it's all houses abutting one on the other. And we'll look in a minute at the various groups. But there's 8 units in all of that. The courtyard in the middle is rather odd. It's a later thing dug into the mound. It had a lot of fill in it, so quite a lot of objects. But you could see a lot of graves cut into this. intramural graves, some of them outside in a courtyard, but it's pretty dense occupation. As I say, this is probably the best single expanse we've got, the most coherent expanse of Kassite domestic architecture. There was no evidence of manufacturing, no evidence of big administrations. It's just people living here. And again, just a summary of the finder. Petra Kremer did the map, but the original mapping must come back to this by the Iraqi colleagues who did the original work. If we look at the units, so there were 8 units funded. So unit 1 to 5, units 1 to 5, that's this little group here. You can see a little self-contained group. 6, 11, and 15, it's this group. This is 15 with all the graves in it. There's another little group there. And then 3, it's this group coming out here to the west. So you can see when you really look at it closely, these are very distinct units. What is nice, and we don't have time to go through it all tonight, is the finds from all of these areas were properly catalogued and identified. So it's possible to put assemblages back into all of these rooms and buildings. But you could see walls preserved to quite a great height, just below the surface, not very deep, nothing below them. They did do excavations all the way down. There was nothing below this level. So this was it. Unit 4, that's that little bit there. You could see them up there, those rooms there. Then we get, those are quite small, those rooms. But then we get this one, 23 to 39, all of these. Great, big complex. So you've got small little houses with a big house, central courtyard. We'll have a look in a minute. This room in particular, very interesting. You could just see it there. We'll look at it more closely. This was a corbelled tomb with three bodies in it, right in the middle of the building. You've got big houses, small houses, all very, very close together. You've got some evidence of passages, and I can possibly see here. 7, 40 to 52, that's this lot here. Again, quite a big collection of rooms. Quite a large area. Then we've got unit 7, 53, 68, all of this lot up here. And then 8, this little up at the top. And then the final small group at the end. A lot of burials, 44 in all. And again, all beautifully recorded, all the finds listed. So we know what was in all these graves and photographs of most of them. So it's quite unusual to get such a good record of all the assemblages. Fairly straightforward burial types of the period. Double jar, this is the one where you've got 2 big pots facing one another with the body inside. A single jar, only 2 of those, both of them with children. There were children, so small, not many grave goods in them. We've got 2 burials with brick structures, one not so elaborate, but one very big elaborate one, corbelled roof, steps leading to a chamber. As I will have a look at that. And then a large number of simple inhumations. These are just people buried below the floors of the houses. And this is what the double jar burials look like. You see, this is the same burial. That's it up on the left there. You can see. And when it's opened up, I hope you could see here, you've got various bits of pottery, jewelry, various objects. You can see there's anklets around the copper anklets around the thing. You've got pottery. That is one of these faience buckets. We'll come back to that in a minute. But a fairly rich assemblage. And that there is it's not a Lamashtu plaque, it looks like it, but it does have a sort of a rough drawing on one side of it. So on the chest of this person, you can see the body's been scrunched up to get it into the double pot burial. It's quite a lot of these found in Babylon and elsewhere. Single jar, these are the children. So the skeletons, obviously with children, tend to not survive terribly well. So there's not often you get many of them. And there's a few objects found with them, some pottery, some beads, some rings, but not a lot. This is the great corbelled tomb. And you can see here that you've got the steps leading down to it, into the burial chamber, and a remarkable collection of objects put with the bodies, and in particular the faience, where you've got this selection of pots. These are little red pots, and they found them at Babylon, but I don't think we found many of them elsewhere. But it's quite clear from this context they found them engraved in Babylon. But here we really have them in this excavation. There's something particular about these pots, that they were meant for burials. The buckets, I can't quite see from this angle, but you can see that they're crushed here. Yeah, but they've been placed next to the bodies. And you could see up here, there's one there with a red pot sat in the bucket. Again, not many of these have been found in situ, but it's quite clear from those that have. These were made deliberately for burials. They're a specific burial item. But, it looks like a rather wealthy family. Whether they were all put in there at the same time, difficult to say. But they're clearly laid out in relationship with one another. It's not an accident that they've been laid out like that. And really quite rich materials with them. And again, we've got nice catalogues of all the objects that they found. The other brick tomb was not quite so elaborate. It had sort of bricks laid on top of it, but this was the only one like this. And these, I'm not sure many of these have been found from Kassite sites. So this is quite a new one. The simple inhumations, well, this is just where a hole has been dug in the ground and somebody's been put in it. And the grave goods that go with them tend to be quite limited. But, there's a few bits and pieces, but these are pretty humble burials and tended to be outside the houses in the courtyard. So not in close association with any of the rooms. As I say, 44 burials in all, in what is actually quite a small area. If we look at the jewelry, most of it is in necklaces, rings, beads. There's some gold, there's copper, anklets, necklaces. You can see this one in particular, anklets around the bones here at the bottom. You can see this is the one with the thing that looks like a Lamastri plug, but isn't quite. Pottery. There's quite a lot of goods with these. And when cleaned up and looked at, this is what the necklaces look like. This is the eye stone with the name Enlil on it. Unfortunately, that was found in a disturbed context, but almost certainly from a burial. And there's lots of lovely necklaces. This is just a small example. Again, all from burials, but you could see different types of stone, faience, quite long, but really rather nice pieces of jewelry, and all recorded in an assemblage. There were also 5-cylinder seals found, and again, it's rare. We don't often get Kassite seals found in excavations, but here's a rather nice one, and I thank John for the translation. He's the maestro of Kassite seal inscription. So, but it's a rather nice standard third Kassite seal style, but rather decorative with the lines of ibixes at the bottom, the presentation scene, very nice, and the prayer, "O Marduk, have mercy," Marduk, the great god of Babylon. But there's also some older seals, some legacies, Isin Lhasa, so that would be almost 600 years old by the time it was in use at this site. And again, an old Babylonian seal and a Mitannian seal, again, much, much older, 300-400 years older. So, you know, were these things used as jewelry? Probably, almost certainly. I mean, I've seen them for sale in the markets in Pakistan and Afghanistan with bits and pieces from Babylonia just being sold as jewelry and amulets. But a lovely seal. Agneta Larson from Yale is publishing these. And of course, pottery. Lots of good standard, if you like pottery, good solid standard Kassite pottery. The classic Kassite flasks, these are those red bottles I was talking about. These are the ones that come from the graves. But there's bowls and the whole assemblage here. And they are pretty solidly 13th century, and they match the sort of material we see in the Diyala region. So, and I'm working on this to get this all published. These are the drawings that our Iraqi colleagues did, so I'm going to claim no credit on these, but a really nice, closed, tight assemblage of 13th century Kassite pottery, very useful for dating other sites. The faience objects, always an interest for me. 4 different types. We've got these things up at the top, which used to be called knobs, but have now got a much clearer identification as elements of chariots. They're the bits you wind ropes around on the various bits for riding chariots. This is one of the faience masks, again, a particular type of object with a Babylonian origin, Kassite Babylonian origin, which were made for burials. A lot of buckets, and I'll come to those in a minute. And then 3 faience vessels, including this multi-chambered one, and just showing you the multi-chambered vessel as it was being excavated. Just starting on the chariot fittings. At the bottom here, this is the best corpus there are. And these are from the stables at P. Ramesses in Egypt. And these were the royal stables where there was lots and lots of evidence for chariots, horses, the whole lot, and lots of these. There's a very big volume publishing all of these. The one at the top was found at Nippur, and you could see it's the same sort of object. These are the things we found at Tel Bas Maya. What's interesting is, and Leo Sassmanhausen, one of the scholars who's done a lot of work on Kassite material, has suggested that wherever horses are found in Babylonian in Kassite Babylonian period, it's royal cavalry. So there is these 3 little knobs that were found, chariot fitting, might suggest that Tel Bas Maya might have been a place where horses and chariots were looked after by the king, or there was perhaps a garrison there. So rather intriguing, 3 little pieces of faience. The faience mask, we've got the drawing. We've got at the top there similar masks are now on display in the Iraq Museum, and these at the bottom from the British Museum next door. They are found across the Middle East, but they do appear to have a Babylonian genesis. Most of them come from Iraq sites. They are not found in Assyria, and the manufacturing is pretty tight in the 14th to 12th century. So again, a pretty good type fossil for the period. A lot of them appear on the antiquities market. If you do a Google search on faience masks, you find quite a lot of these for sale. So obviously graves and that have been looted over the years. The buckets are quite interesting. piece of work I did quite a long time ago on these. I defined 8 forms, and you could see at the top right-hand corner there's some of them on display in the British Museum. Pretty straightforward, the 8 forms, whether there was circles round the rims and that have you, but all of them have pretty much the same form with the 2 little handles sticking up, probably a string handle or grass or something like that. And from tombs. At Basmaya, we've got a new form. And this one, the handle is horizontal inside the bucket. So we've got a new form. Quite exciting for those of us who like Kassite buckets. I'm perhaps the only fan, but there you go. We've got a map there at the bottom of the distribution of them, but it is interesting that there's a site Tel Imla here up the Diyala corridor where they were obviously making them. There's no evidence for that here. They were using them in graves, presumably to have some sort of liquid in them. Not sure, but they were deposited in the grave. Metal tools. It was an interesting group of tools. You could see here at the bottom when they were found. You could see a couple of daggers, quite a lot of chisels in the drawings on the right there. At the top, they've sort of been schematically laid out, but you could see how they were actually found. No evidence for a bag is recorded, but they were found on the floor of the room. And it does have the look of, a workman's tool bag. It's a collection of bronze objects, but again, rather nice finding Kassite metal tools in situ. It's pretty much doubles our corpus of such material, so quite interesting. Ground stone, not very glamorous, but was obviously in use in domestic structures. Loom weights, whetstones, again, all found in a little group on the floor of one of the rooms, suggesting a very domestic function. It comes back to what these houses were, what these structures were. They were domestic. The tablets, Elena De Vecchi is working on these. Unfortunately, it's not a coherent corpus, but there's enough that of interest, and there's a couple that are dated to Kadash Turgu, which does give us a very nice confirmation of the date of the site. I mean, everything else indicates 13th century, but here we are. As I say, the dating of the site, if we come back to that map I showed earlier on, pretty solidly 13th century. And the site fits into the pattern of Kassite settlement on the other side of the Tigris, the east side of the Tigris. It falls into that third group I indicated earlier on, which is the majority of the Trans-Tigris sites. It seems to have been an expansion of Kassite settlement at that point in the 13th and 12th century, which is slightly odd because there were quite a lot of wars went on in the late 13th century, 12th century, where the Elamites came in across the frontier. But Basmaya, we don't know the name of the original name of the site. Basmaya thrived at that point. The publication has just come out. It's in the latest volume of Mesopotamia. I do want to say thanks to the editorial team at Mesopotamia, because we produced this at great speed. But you could see the people who worked on it. And in a way, it's an example of post-COVID use of Zoom, because we never actually met. So we had someone in Babylon, somebody in Yale, someone in Turin, me in Oxford, and yet we managed to work together on this and produce the publication. It's and I'd like to suggest it's quite a nice way of illustrating how working with Iraqi colleagues can really work. It's worth trying. It's really worth trying, and you get great results like this publication. Well, I think it's great. It's a great site, even if we haven't done it full justice, and further bits will come out. But it is a good example of multinational work with Iraqi colleagues, even in difficult days. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much indeed. That was fantastic, two-part lecture, and great to finish with that sense that archaeology can be done by Zoom, not something I think many of us have considered before. I'm sure there must be questions coming from either end of that lecture. So,
there was a reference to the word Sinjar, and there's a mountain in the north of Iraq where the Yazidi community sort of lives, and that's called Sinjar. Is that a relationship?
You pick a really interesting issue, because there's also a Roman camp, Singara, which was in Sinjar. It looks as that should be related, but there's no consensus that it is. I mean, it's in the right place, more or less. It's, yeah, but I think there's still some doubts about it. So for the moment, I'm letting the deep philology experts work on that one. I'm not a deep philologist. And so I'm not going to venture into that world. Oh, well, you know, it's quite obvious. You know, you knock a few vowels out and you've got the same word. Come on, why isn't it the same? But you're right. It is a subject that's discussed quite a lot.
It's interesting that you refer to the word as SNGR rather than speculate what it should be.
Well, it's quite often written Sangar. Quite often, I found when you start going through looking, you know, as I did cataloging it, unless you look at the original transcription in translations, it just comes out as Babylonia. So you lose this history of the word and the context because it's just called Babylonia. And then when you start putting it back to the original word, some of the texts start making a little bit more sense. You know, Tutmosis conquering Babylonia. Well, of course he didn't happen. But, you know, when you put it into this context, you know, it suddenly starts making sense. And even, you know, things like the Amarna letters, you know, and the Hittite treaties, you have to comb through them and say, well, that one was Karduniash, that one was Sankara. And then but in you know, if you're not careful, it just gets translated as Babylonian, which of course it is, but in different times to different people. But no, you pick on a really interesting point. So I think watch the space. Yeah. No, I'd love it to be that. But yeah.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that very illuminating, fascinating lecture. You've done a lot of work on Ur, identifying Kassite material in Ur. I'm wondering if these discoveries at Tel Bas Maya confirm, generally speaking, your dating of the pottery and other things from Ur. I'm asking this because, as we all know, the stratigraphy at Ur is very, very confused, and it's difficult to identify what is Kassite, Assyrian, and so on and so forth.
I think I'd be better placed to answer that once I've really gone through the pottery. Because one of the problems, as any of us have worked on Ur know, is that Woolley, brilliant though he was, published type pottery without provenances. So in his volume 8 on the Kassite period at Ur and volume 9, which there's an overlap, there's lots and lots of plates of pottery drawings, but you can't put them into a context. And so, and I've worked a bit in the basement at Philadelphia, where they've got a lot of Ur pottery, and it's shelves of this stuff. But it doesn't really help you because you can't put it into I think because this is such a tightly dated group of pottery, and of course, James Armstrong and Herman Gash have done a lot of work on the pottery. I think it will help put it in. I think the Ur material, as far as I was able to date any of it, was sort of 13th century as well. There's buckets, there's face masks, the textual material, but it's very badly damaged and churned around. But of course, we also know that Kurigalzu repaired the temple, the ziggurat. So that's early 14th century. But the stuff we've actually got in excavation from Woolley's material, I think is more 13th century. So pretty much like this. Yeah. So I'm hoping. I'll come back in a year's time and do a very boring lecture on pottery.
You may have said it, but how long did it take them to do the excavation? Was it a couple of years, or was it really a fast one?
It was about 3 months in all.
Oh, that's
They had to work. It was a rescue dig.
Yeah.
And I take my hat off to them. 'Cause,
it's
you know,
amazing.
they a lot of detail. When you go into the if you do have a look at the publication, we put the finds catalogue up, but it's not even the whole finds catalogue because the graves are being published by Petra Kremer, and we just didn't have space in Mesopotamia to do the whole thing. So yeah, I mean, they worked at speed, they drew it, they photographed it. It's in all, it was 3 months over 2 seasons.
Very impressive.
Right. So now there was one grave you showed, which had some 4 people in it, actually. It looked like a whole family. And I just wondered if there'd been any thought about why. Was it some disease rather than a slaughter? Do you suppose there's been no further work or thoughts or conclusions about it, I suppose?
I mean, it's adults, and we can speculate. Unfortunately, the skeletons are not available for study, and they worked at speed. So it's quite. There was none of the burials on the site of any sign of trauma wounds or anything like that. So just looking at the skeletons as they are, it looks as though these are 3 grown-ups who, died. But the close proximity does suggest that they died at the same time, because if it had been done over, 10 years, by the time you come to do the 3rd one, you move the bones across a bit. But that obviously hasn't happened here. The pottery and everything, it's all laid out in one group. So whatever happened to this group of people, and one can suppose it was a family. Why else would you put 3 people into one grave, neatly laid out, and really quite a rich grave, in the middle of the settlement? One can speculate, but it looks as though they all died at the same time. Given the relationship in one grave, one supposes a family. So disease,
There were no other graves like this, sort of contemporary, with groups.
You get them in Middle Assyrian sites.
I mean, in this particular.
Oh no. Everything else was, it was like that, single burials. So to have this one where you've got 3 people with, carefully laid out, and because it was corbelled, because the earth hasn't crushed them, they've melted down. So you've got where the pots really were. So you've got that red jar inside a faience bowl. If the earth had been on it, it would have crushed the pot. It didn't happen. So you've got it pretty much as it was. I mean, a long time later, obviously, when they put them in. And soil obviously has seeped in over the years, but it's yeah, it's got. I would say it's a group put in at the same time and must be a family.
Were the bricks actually? I mean, they look burnt. I mean, it's a kiln barred.
Yeah, so these are, yeah, and the floor is.
Were any of them signed?
No, no, unfortunately, there's no brick stamps or anything like that. But it's quite elaborate too. It's and the little steps going down to it, it's quite grand. It wouldn't have been just, you didn't just put grandpa under the floor. This would have been something quite visible. That is it's a remarkable grave. And, to have so many of these faience buckets in there, again, just highlights the ritual nature of the use of those buckets. Yeah, they are rather nice.
Have there been any estimates of the age at which they died?
As I say, unfortunately, we can't examine the skeletons where we could be.
Where are they now?
Somewhere in storage in Baghdad, but it's quite difficult to, and it's 2013, 2014, it's 10 years ago. But, clearly adults, but age, whether they're old adults or difficult to tell. And it's difficult even to say whether it's females and males.
How long is that strip? The measuring strip?
I think they're in 10 centimeter blocks.
10, so that's
Yeah.
4.8 meters wide.
Yeah.
These are quite
big.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a big tomb. It's a serious thing. And then you've got these stairs. Well, big legs as well. This is a very tall person, yeah. A basketball player.
That's sort of proportion.
Yeah.
Coming back to the skeletons, could they not, I mean, if we did, we've done this in Central Asia, if you got some samples of the molars, would the Iraqi Department of Antiquities not allow them to be exported? Enormous results come out on DNA and health and stress from isotopic examination just of the molars. They, you pack them up in a little package and they send them off. They don't have to have a look at the whole skeleton, but it does reveal so much, and that would show if there are kinship relations between them, all sorts of information. It's a pity that the Department of Antiquities maybe haven't been approached in this way, or if they have, that they couldn't be persuaded to change their opinion.
Well, Petra, who's working on these, who's going to publish them, obviously would like to do that.
Yeah.
But one's dealing with a hard-pressed department with.
But the thing is, they just need to send it. She would have to find, or someone else would have to find the funding. Apart from Oxford, there's a brilliant institute at Tartu in Estonia, and we sent off 12 teeth samples from Syriac inhumations, much later, of course, from Central Asia. And remarkable results came back. I mean, obviously you wouldn't ask them for funds, but it's been the sort of thing that fundraising could subsidize and could be a really important insight. Certainly
it's an ambition, Erica, because this one is so striking.
Yes.
That it would be great to be able to do that. Yeah. Tom.
A very quick question. Is this very important article available on academia?
If you email me, I'll send you one, but it's just been published, and I mean, literally, I think 2 weeks ago. So I feel a bit mean just putting it up there. And, as treasurer of BC, I quail when I see Iraq articles going up weeks after publishing. I'd quite like people to buy the journal, but But certainly if you email me, I could send you a copy.
Tim, thank you very much for a wonderful survey of the Kassites. I was struck by what you said wasn't a Lamashtu amulet. That's the little square thing with a bit sticking out from it. And you said that there was a figure on it.
Well,
Now,
it's a very rough scratch design rather than a figure. I mean, it's got the shape of a Lamashtu, but it's...
so has it got any writing on the other
No.
side?
No, it's totally rough figurative. Sorry, I don't have I could send you a picture of it if you want, but
No, well, it's very interesting because I've seen a number of rather poor Lamashtu amulets that I always imagined were cheap copies of proper ones which have magic writing on them. But actually you seem to have got one that's several centuries earlier than all the other examples.
yeah, because the Lamashtu plaques, I think the best dated ones are definitely first millennium. I think there's one that there's a lot of argument about whether it's from the Kassite, but one from Ur. But I think the context it was found was so disturbed. I don't think it could be securely dated to the Kassite period. So, but I'll send you a photo, an image of it. But there's nothing obviously Lamashtu about it apart from that shape. And the fact that it's here.
Is she a woman wearing it?
Well, we don't know.
Yes.
Yeah. It's hard to say. I mean, it might be an indicator that it is a woman. You know.
Any other questions? And indeed, conversation, of course, can continue over a glass of wine afterwards. But first, I'd like to invite Rosamond Wade to do a vote of thanks.
Well, it just leaves me to say thank you so much to Tim for an illuminating talk, which raised a lot of questions, and obviously you're going to have a lot of fun trying to unravel them all. But that was great, and I'm rather glad to have seen it in person and not to have had it yet another Zoom. So thank you very much. But thank you to all you all for coming, and thank you for those who are forced to watch on Zoom. But we all enjoyed it, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.